talking about how technology has transformed the way that we remember. If you've got any questions, then do please pop them in the chat box, which is great. You've got the hang of that. And we will look at any questions at the end of the session. So this morning, we're going to talk through the role that technology has played in online tributes over time, but particularly focusing on the last 2 decades, how online tributes have shifted the way that people mourn and how they have become the normal, and how technology has allowed funeral directors to create a much deeper connection directly with families. So for those of you that don't know, I'm Sally, and I'm Head of Partnerships at Much Loved, and I'm joined today by my colleague Richard Baker, who's one of our senior account managers who looks after lots of our funeral director partners, who's been with us for 11 years. So together we've got at least 30 years of experience of working in tribute funds and supporting the bereaved. So firstly, I wanted to take a look at early trends of how people grieved. And some of this you may well be aware of working in the sector that you work. Victorian society had a fascination with death and remembrance. Memento mori is a Latin phrase that means remember that you must die. That's deeply ingrained into their culture. The era was marked by elaborate mourning customs and a societal preoccupation with death, and it was largely due to high mortality rates from diseases. And the Victorians believed that acknowledging death was essential for a good death. Families commissioned photographs of deceased, so they'd often be sort of posed peacefully as though they were sleeping, and I did have a photo of that, but my colleague took that out. And memorial jewellery, similar to what's available today, rings, brooches, lockets, were often crafted using the deceased hair or engraved with dates. But then later, world wars, that changed lots of things, and millions of people died, often anonymously. Families rarely saw the deceased. People weren't able to linger on grief, and it became much more restrained. That kind of elaborate mourning that we saw in the Victorian era gave way to quiet remembrance. But mourning, sort of public mourning, was seen through state funerals where public emotion was seen but channeled through ceremony or protocol. And in the 1970s, there were examples of cultural mourning when Elvis Presley died, for example, and fans created makeshift shrines and gathered at Graceland. And that's an example of sort of an early example of celebrity fan-driven emotional and personal public mourning. And then we saw John Lennon's death also through vigils in Central Park and across the world where there was shared public grief. Now, in 1997, when Princess Diana died, this had a profound and lasting impact on public mourning. And I'm not sure of the age range of the audience, but you may well remember it. I certainly do. Millions of people mourned openly, leaving flowers and notes and personal tributes outside Kensington Palace and other memorial sites. People engaged in acts of remembrance that went way beyond those kind of traditional rituals that we'd only seen before, organising their own vigils and creating makeshift memorials. Her funeral was very unusual. People lined the streets of London the whole way out, and then again in Northampton where she was buried. And I really remember that because I moved house that day from London, drove up to Milton Keynes. So I kind of followed the funeral procession, and the streets were North London were completely deserted, and you'll never see it like that unless it's sort of very early on Christmas morning, just with a few kind of flowers across the street. It was quite eerie. But what happened was her death really helped to normalise public emotion and made it socially acceptable for people to mourn collectively and visibly. And there were a few message boards hosted by a couple of media outlets that became informal grief hubs, and the technology was starting to be developed for what we now recognise as tributes, online tributes. So in 1999, muchlove.com, the domain was registered, but we didn't do anything with it because there wouldn't have been any real take up if we had launched, because technology wasn't really ready. Digital cameras were just emerging in the shops in this kind of era. Internet speeds were pretty poor. People were using dial-ups. It was expensive and unusual to have a home computer. But to be fair, society wasn't really ready for it either. And the thought of having a website for a dead person was met with an incredulous or very blank face. And they simply turned away and changed the subject. Now, in the UK, Gone Too Soon were the first to launch, and Much Loved came a couple of months later. We would have liked to have claimed to be the very first to launch, but it would be remiss of me not to tell you the truth. And you can see here a shot on the slide of Rene's tribute, and that was one of the very first tribute pages created on our service, and that's still being used today. And at the same time, the US-based sites were starting, but in a very kind of basic in terms of functionality and design, a bit more of a sort of replica of a newspaper obituary listing rather than a tribute page. Now, in this era was a period of education from our point of view as the seeds of change were planted. And we spent time building our relationships within the funeral profession and getting an understanding of how technology could support you and in helping your families to remember. Part of this was to take our first intrepid steps to the National Funeral Exhibition, and that is what this picture is. God, it makes me feel slightly old looking at that, because that was a very long time ago. And we were initially met with a mixed response. And I think that was due to a lack of awareness of what such a service could offer, perhaps apprehension about how to relay that to families, and a kind of lack of confidence in the technology. Towards the end of this period, we saw our first funeral director partner, which was a fantastic experience. And that was Richard Deal and Partners who took that on. And there's a short quote from them about why they chose to sort of take the plunge with us. So as we move on into the takeoff phase, we now start to see the usage of social media. So in particular, YouTube and Facebook, which give people more confidence in putting personal content online. We originally launched with a community chat on Much Loved, but that was no longer required at this time as the social platforms sort of took up that mantle. And at the same time, we at Much Loved started to make tributes automatically public, whereas originally we always set every page to private. Also, technology became much more affordable. Most families had broadband, laptops were more accessible, and mobile phones, I think about 74% of households had one, and also had access to broadband by this time. And smartphones went from something like 30% of UK adults to over 60% of adults owning a device. So confidence in this technology, along with the funeral profession starting to grow, we saw about 20 companies coming on board during this period. And people were becoming much more accepting of that concept of a tribute page. So within a family unit, you'd often have one person who was actually very keen on the idea. So part of this new social acceptance was also down to change in behaviour at funerals. People were moving away from giving flowers to making donations to a family's chosen charity instead. And the top technology was now in place to make that happen. So we had good digital payment mechanisms, so Apple Pay, Google Pay, contactless, things that we take for granted now, and really good sort of payment processing through companies like Stripe and PayPal. And we also had API connections. So that's a connection that allows things to move directly, information to move directly from one system to another. And so there were API connections for funeral directors that meant tribute information could display directly on their websites, and that pages could be created directly through your funeral management systems. So also, thanks to the technology in place by Google with maps and their payment platforms, meant that online funeral notices could display really well with interactive maps and provide a way for people to be able to make donations online. And this image here shows an example of Much Love's funeral notices where there were others that entered the market during this space as well. So, for example, Memory Giving, set up by A.B. Walker, Funeral Zone, now called Funeral Guide, and Love to Donate, who we took over at the beginning of last year. But so by this stage, most funeral directors had some sort of way of collecting online donations. And there was also a rise in direct cremations at this point. So whilst these were already in existence, around, I think it was around 2016 when those two rather well-known large services launched. It was also around the time that David Bowie's death, when he very famously opted for a direct cremation. But what's important is without that physical service, families often seek alternative ways to honour the deceased and support the causes they cared about. And online tributes very much kind of fill that gap and provide a place for people to come together. Even though it's virtual, it plays a vital role and a talking point for when people really do come together. So the pandemic forced us to engage with technology. I mean, that we all saw that. So everything we did was pretty much driven online, apart from you guys who still had to go to work. You know, if we wanted to socialize with friends or shop or fundraise, you know, lots of charities were creating virtual fundraising opportunities as everything in person was cancelled. And there was a significant change in the technology around funerals as well, so that live streaming, whilst it had already been available, it really came into its own during this phase. Originally started in the 1990s with dial-ups and webcams. Technology wasn't really kind of good enough until sort of Obertus and Wesley Media really got behind it. But the pandemic hit and we had no choice but to use it. And now it's pretty standard at every funeral. And the same goes for QR codes. That technology had already been in place, but it had kind of passed us by. But it really got its spotlight, and you couldn't order a pint without using one. And now we're regularly seeing them on the backs of order of services, pointing funeral guests to their tribute page. And also, tributes became a fundamental part of funerals, kind of catapulted into the public domain, which helped them to become normalised. And we're now seeing content collected from the pages used within the funeral service by celebrants and ministers, and funeral guests are being invited to contribute to the pages, providing a source of comfort to the bereaved family. So before I hand over to Richard, I just wanted to show you the kind of growth that we've seen in the use of tribute pages over the last 15 years. And you can see here from this graph that they are becoming more and more commonplace.
Thank you, Sally. Lovely introduction. Bit of history for you all there. Yeah, you can see from the screen there, the 1 in 5 UK deaths now has a Much Loved page. We can only really sort of talk from confidently about the statistics that we see on our own service. Last year, 2025, we saw about 95,000 pages were created. That's about 300 every single day, although it is heavily skewed to weekday use, obviously funeral directors being the primary source of those pages. And we've seen this increase, you saw from the previous chart, accelerate year on year, especially since the pandemic. The growth is roughly about 20% year on year, and we do expect to see this figure to continue to grow as both yourselves, funeral directors, and members of the public embrace, understand, and trust the technology and actually appreciate the benefits that online memorialisation can bring. The second stat there, that's the 1 in 2. Now that refers to all online memorialisation. As Sally mentioned, there are other dedicated platforms similar to ours, Memory Giving, Funeral Guide, Funeral Zone, other smaller providers, We also see funeral directors developing their own service and publish their own notices. And of course, your local but nationally owned newspapers, you put in your printed obituary that often generates an online obituary as well. But by far the biggest change we've seen, it's probably going to come as no surprise. It's about the sharing of these announcement pages on various social media channels that's really making the difference. Historically, funeral notices served simply as an announcement of death, but they're now used as platforms for sharing not only the practical information about the funeral, the date, time, location, etc., but they go on now to describe what dress code you should wear, sharing webcasts or even polls to see who will be attending the wake. And obviously, they are now the sort of trusted, efficient, and safe management tool for charitable donations. But we've now moved on even further, and pages are being well used well after the day of the funeral, and in many cases have become a valued repository for shared memories, a space that enables family and friends to manage their grief in their own way, or they've gone on to help ignite interest in particular causes. So, should you use a specialist or a generalist for your funeral announcements? Now, I've got a couple of Facebook pages here. I'm going to call Facebook the generalist and ourselves the specialists. Got a couple of real examples here of funeral directors creating posts to announce their funerals, which is absolutely fine. Kind of got no issue with that at all, but it does have its drawbacks. There's no sort of funeral details for people to share. There's no links to any charities. They are open to use and abused by anybody online. There's little to no moderation as well on those pages, and there's very little option for privacy. And whilst these pages are set up and used with the best intention, Facebook and other social medias are not specialists. As you know, they have to cater for a broad variety of other content, so responses are constrained and control is limited. My analogy is it's a bit like having a handyman come to do jobs in your house. They can probably throw some paint around a little bit, fix a leaky tap or cut your grass. But if you want your house professionally repainted, you would call the professional decorators. If you're going to put in a new bathroom, you're going to call the plumber or get your boiler serviced. And if you want to put in a new patio and pergola for the summer that your wife's probably seen on Instagram, then you'd actually go out and call the landscapers. Social feeds are not selective. 1 minute you'll be looking at a friend's funeral feed, like these two examples here, but then with the next swipe of your finger, you'll be looking at probably some weight loss fad that's happening, or what's happening around here is everyone banging on about the potholes in the road. Social media is great, but it's not really the answer. So what is the answer? We see the best solution as the specialist page being shared, not created on social media, and this can actually have a huge impact. Like any growing organisation, a lot of Sally and my time is spent in meetings, working on development, managing the platform. But one thing that does keep us quite grounded, and certainly me, and motivated, is seeing the pages that get set up, and that behind every single page that gets set up, there's an individual, someone who was loved, cared for, and remembered. And as we move further and further into a world with deeper online connections, we're seeing more and more examples of these memorial pages becoming much more than simply a place to remember. Pages can not only be used for remembrance and a tool for fundraising, but pages can inspire, educate, and support. Now, the page I've got displayed up there is in memory of a young lady, Nikki Newman, who passed away in 2023. She was aged just 26. She shared her journey through a 4-year battle with breast cancer on her Instagram page, where she had a huge following. But rather sort of recoil away from the effects of the disease, she used that platform to educate and inspire others, to educate and inspire others by using such phrases, "Go check your tatties," and spreading her mantra of "Go grab life." When she passed away in 2023, her husband Alex created a much loved page and linked it to that Instagram page, which instantly became a lightning rod for an outpouring of messages of support and charitable donations. Messages poured in from around the world, mostly from people that had never met Nikki, but felt a real connection with her through that Instagram page. In fact, it was my wife, who was one of her followers, who alerted me one evening to her page, and I could only watch incredulously as the messages poured in. One of her little signature things was a lightning bolt tattoo, which, having witnessed a lightning bolt on a dark, stormy night, had shown her there was always some light, even in the darkest of storms. And this went on to inspire lots of her followers to get similar tattoos, and that's the little picture there on the right. We've since been in close contact with her husband, Alex, who was absolutely, as you can understand, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support on the page. I think, Sally, I think I'm right in saying that her page is highlighted on our website. Is that right? So if you do want to go and take a look, it is on the Much Love website.
Yes, it's one of the sort of featured pages.
Featured pages, yeah. There we are. Similarly, here's another page that had a similar sort of result. This is a page to James Brockenshaw, who was a serving MP. He died of lung cancer in 2021. His page not only received huge coverage in the national press, but it was also shared on all the popular social media platforms. You can see there from the total that it raised an enormous amount for the Roy Castle Lung Foundation. But it ended up going way beyond that. His wife, pictured within there, used the momentum that the page created to build a platform for further research into the lung cancer support. Is actually now sitting on the board of the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation. These sort of pages go to show that what starts off as a simple tribute page can really take off and provide untold benefits, not only for a bereaved family, but also to the wider benefit of other organisations. But I don't want you to think it's all about sort of huge fundraising pages or pages in memory of celebrities, public figures, or those with large social followings. A tribute page is for everyone. They can provide a dignified, safe and private space for anyone coming to remember a loved one. The page I've highlighted here was a page to in memory of a Mr. Norton, set up by the Co-op in 2022. It contained all the sort of practical details about his funeral, and it raised, as you can see, a modest sum for his chosen charity. But it is visited nearly every day by his son, who leaves messages, pictures, lights candles, describing how he is getting on and how his own family is now growing up. Another page there on the right to Mr. Moss, again raised a modest amount for his chosen charity, but it provides a space for his wife and wider family to come regularly leave candles, share pictures and messages. A page like this doesn't judge or provide pressure, but it allows people to grieve in their own way in a dignified and private space at their own pace. We could show thousands of examples of these kind of pages that are revisited continually. Some, like these ones here, visited very regularly, others maybe just on special occasions, on anniversaries, or many that have become real focus for ongoing fundraising. As we all know, there's no fixed route through grief. We all take our own journey, and online memorialisation is just one additional tool. But we can see from both the use of the platform and feedback from our users, it's proving to be an extremely valuable and is becoming far more commonplace. So where does this all lead? Whilst it is impossible to predict the future, given the path that we've observed and been a part of for the last 20 years or so, the use of online memorialisation is only going to grow and grow and become more and more normalised as the current generation, the Gen Zs out there, born online, who will become the next generation to require all our services. As well as the funeral director, we see providers of funeral management systems, other grief organisations, social medias and other funeral professionals, ministers, celebrants, other funeral tech providers, all wanting access to information on our sites. In a world between the world between us is becoming far more intertwined, integrated and complex, but ultimately I believe it will become more intuitive to use. For us at Much Loved, we will listen to our clients and customers. We will continue to innovate. We will continue to develop and enhance our platform. We will deepen integrations with third parties, and we will explore emerging and new technologies. We do see also a future where increased demand for further legislation within the industry and transparency will compel the funeral industry to continue to invest in technology, and a tribute page will just be a part of that. If you ask me to sort of look into a fairly whimsical crystal ball as to where the future might go, Sandy mentioned about the sort of rather old technology of a QR code. We see it completely normalised now, everything we do. We will see that, I believe, on headstones. I think that has actually happened. You know, one quick scan with your phone, you'll have all the life history of that individual. I can also see a future where instant family trees could be developed. All the threads of information are out there being pieced together by the likes of Ancestry, but with the development of AI, all this information will be easily sort of managed. I remember when I was small, actually, my uncle or aunt I had shown this sort of raft of papers that spent years putting together our sort of rather limited family tree. All of that will be available at a click of a finger, a click of a button. I'm sure many of you have witnessed the modernisation of chapels and crematoria around the country. The inclusion of immersive smart audio-visual displays celebrating the life of the deceased with increased personalisation and sophistication. That's only going to get more and more commonplace. But what's the future hold there? You know, are we going to see holographic memorials, old family photos being brought to life, maybe even holograms of the deceased themselves attending their own funeral in a rather macabre, aberresque sort of concert manner? Who knows? All I know is that things never stand still for long, and for some of us, the most exciting innovations that we see in other walks of our life were once just figments of our imagination. If you can sit there now, imagine your life without the phone, which is probably just to your left or right, your smartwatch that's monitoring your heart constantly, your preheated car seats for before you get in, or the ubiquitous, you know, Alexa providing everything at home. So as we come to the end of our presentation here, just to summarise, we've seen how attitudes towards memorialisation have transformed through the years. It's never stopped evolving, and it never will. We hope we've demonstrated that there's a deep and growing history in the current online space, and that tributes aren't a fad or going away, and that online memorials have a reach that some of you may have not realised. Technology really is an enabler in this space and is here to stay. But the good news for you is that there's no need to be an innovator in this sector. The providers of this technology are already in place. My final thought on this: simply carry on being the amazing caring specialist that you are, and we'll carry on being the specialists that we are, and in partnership we can make the most out of the available technology to carry on looking after those that we look after.